Hello, everyone. I'm Taylor Campbell. I am the Deputy Director of the Data and Digital Portfolio here at the Beeck Center. And I'm so pleased to be in the company of Cyd Harrell, the author of A Civic Technologist's Practice Guide. Welcome, Cyd. Um,
Thank
in
you
this
so much.
in this inaugural installment of our Public Interest Tech Bookshelf Book Talk, Cyd and I, we're going to talk about, we're going to have a candid conversation. And we're going to talk about the ways in which her book teaches new practitioners everything they need to know about the field of public interest technology, also known as civic technology, and where we hope for it to go in the years ahead. So Cyd, thank you for being here, and thank you for writing a book that truly sets a strong baseline for the field of civic technology and for how we want this field to operate in the future. I have my book here, and I'm so excited to dig in. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to you and the team at the Beck Center for your support during the process as well.
Of course, of course. So this let's dive right in, if that's okay with you.
That's
Um,
awesome.
this stage was set, and we really did a lot of promotion specifically to people who are working in tech, primarily private sector tech, who may be curious about the field of civic tech or curious about how their tech skills and their tech careers can have more of an impact. I love that. I think that that is exactly the conversation that we should be having. And so I'm excited to dig in, and hopefully just get some real stuff on the table today about what that really means and how it might, what might come with it. And so I'm really excited to dig in. So the first question that I have for you, just generally speaking, why did you write this book and why did you publish it at this time in 2020 in the middle of a global pandemic?
Um, I wrote this book. The inspiration was actually from a conference a few years ago called the Union of Concerned Government Technologists. And there was a session called Let's Make New Mistakes,
Mm,
where a bunch of people gathered together and talked about um, how it's time for us to come together as a field. We've sort of existed formally for 8 or 10 years. And how can we help new people entering level up quickly on all the things that people who've been in it 8 or 10 years have figured out and not make some of the mistakes we made before. As far as why now, I didn't plan to do it during a pandemic. I started just after the holidays last year. I did, however, give myself a deadline of before this election.
mm,
Um, we're just a couple weeks before here, but it was my husband who said to me, "This is a great idea. And you should probably publish it before the election because if we get a change of administration, a lot of people are going to want to do this."
yeah.
And I think even if we don't get a change of administration, we're going to see a lot of people want to do this at the state or city level as well. So I set myself a deadline and it turned out a pandemic happened. Um,
Turns out.
and yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay. So building off of that a little bit, I want to understand how you define civic tech. In our work at the Beck Center, we use public interest tech as kind of our descriptive catch-all title phrase. But it's also civic tech. I've also heard, um, digital service. There are a few kind of related
GovTech.
terms.
Yeah.
I love GovTech. I'd love to kind of get your working definition, at least the one that you're using in the book, just to kind of level set for our attendees so that we can have a better understanding of like, am I even thinking of the right field here before we start to dig into kind of some of the meat of what the advice that you're giving, what the advice is that you're giving to folks who are looking to join.
Absolutely. So I I love public interest tech. I think it's a really strong phrase. I think civic tech is a little bit narrower in that civic tech refers specifically to bringing the best of private sector tech, whether that might be methods or people or actual, specific technologies into public sector or institutional contexts. Although there's also, I don't want to leave out the mutual aid context where we build something that helps communities respond to a disaster or helps communities plan together, something like that. I think Civic Tech has room for that as well. Yeah. And this is not the only definition, but it is the one I used in the book, is we want to be able to exercise our rights and build our communities with the same kind of affordances that we get in our lives as more commercial beings.
Got it. Wow, I love that. And that's actually an interesting lens, which is different from the one that I had been operating from. So that's really helpful to hear. Relatedly, what is your working definition of a technologist? I know that in the book you do a really beautiful job of kind of shouting out that spectrum of folks who might fall into this pretty broad category, from people who are really amazing with Microsoft Excel, to people who are front-end web designers, to people who do DevOps, to product managers. How do I know if I am a technologist who might want to consider this field?
So I think if you work on technology and, across all of the fields you said, and I myself come from user research, which is widely seen as a technology discipline, but not a technical discipline. And I think that's very important, that technologists are not just people who are in a quantitative or technical discipline. It's not just the coders. It's all the designers, the product managers. And if you are someone who works on, intellectual property law for technology, you have a claim to be a technologist too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that distinction between technological and technical. The technology it's all encompassing. That's awesome. I have so many quotes. You have so many quotables in this book. I pulled a bunch of them out because I will be tweeting them just throughout my life. And I want to kind of use some of these quotes to anchor our conversation. So the first one that really stood out to me, and I think about, if I'm trying to enter, if I'm curious about entering this space, you do a good job of laying out what I would refer to as myths. Might come in. Yeah, but people might come into this thinking, are going to be the case, especially if they come from a private sector tech experience, that just need to be busted, like before you show up and you're just way wrong, right? And I love that you, in your book, you give a pretty comprehensive breakdown of all of the different aspects of what someone might experience in this space, and how to be ready, how to be ready to be adaptable in ways that were new to me even. So I've worked in federal government tech, I've worked in local government tech in LA, and I got a lot out of reading your book. So I imagine that somebody who does not
makes me so happy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I imagine that somebody who does not have, yet have firsthand experience in a government space or in a public interest space, really needs to dig into these, being prepared for the myths, to recognize that the myths that they may bring just aren't true. And so I want to dig into some of those myths. And one of the things that you just kind of knocked me over the head with is when you said that innovation, like take innovation and like ball it up and throw it in the trash. It's basically what you said. That's not a direct quote though. I was really like, okay, Cyd, what do we have to say about innovation? Like, what's wrong with innovation? But I love what you wrote. You said, we all lose out when we subscribe to the idea that innovation has to come from outside government, which is implied by setting up special teams to do it. This attitude overlooks the innovative work the career staff are already doing. One of the best things you can do is find people who have created innovative workarounds and hacks in any arena using the tools they have, and do what you can to empower them. If you're going to accept innovation as a description in your own work, make sure that light shines on them as well. I love that, Cyd. I love that. That is a direct quote. And I really want to just to hear from you about because there's a few things in that, right? One is innovation, as we might assume its definition, needs to be challenged and needs to be thought of, not necessarily balled up and thrown in the trash, but it needs to be rethought in terms of something that's a collaborative,
Yes.
effort with those who are already who dedicated their lives to the public interest, before you showed up, right? So can you talk a
Yes.
little bit about that and how folks who are ready to see if they have a space in this field, can really be mindful about how to approach that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, we go into this thinking we want to move things forward. And sometimes we think, well, we need to be more innovative and do more new things. But what we really need is better things. Um, and a lot of the time, if you haven't gone into government spaces and met a lot of public servants, you may not realize how hard people are working to try to find their way to provide great service to the public. Because in my experience, I have met a lot of public servants at this point. I have been one for a couple of years on a federal term. I now work for a state judicial agency as a consultant. Um, there are incredibly smart, committed people doing the very best with the tools that they have. And for example, in the judicial system, I am never going to know as much about the law as an attorney who works for the civil rights organization at the state. But I know a lot about user research and UX design that isn't accessible to them right now. Um, and so I can see, and I find people every time I start working with a government agency who say something like, oh, I'm not savvy about tech. Um, all I do is I built this really complicated Excel sheet to use this data that we get from another department and convert it into the format that we need. And then we publish it through this really tricky chain because we don't have great tools, to this set of assessors who need to have it to understand what's going on in our community. And I just don't know anything about technology. And I'm like, you are doing clever, smart technology in a really difficult environment. And
Yeah.
I can come right in and identify you as a fellow technologist and tell you that you are. My friend Jess McMullen kind of refers to this as the welcome to Hogwarts moment,
Mhm.
um, saying, hey, you do this already, you're innovative. Um, but hey, I can offer you a whole world of practice and community
Mhm.
that can help you do this better um, or more easily and kind of give you back um, control over some of this. If I come in and say, hey, I am here to innovate, we are going to do the cool stuff.
Yeah.
You probably don't know what you're up to because you haven't been in tech.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's going to be a really different style of interaction. And it's not one I enjoy. It's one that sometimes attracts funding. So you see it
Mm.
happen. But I think that as useful as innovation can be as a frame to say we are going to make a change, maybe we're going to attract some support for it. Um, if you do it in a way that isn't inclusive of people who may have been innovating the policy or really coming up with interesting workarounds in the technology or implementation space,
Yeah.
it's going to be short-lived and it's not going to be nearly as interesting and powerful as it could be.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. You also talk about the experience of, often privilege among technologists,
Yes.
representing, issues that affect people, who are marginalized. So I think it's similar, right? It's similar in that I think you wrote, one particularly noxious form of privilege is when overrepresented people find out about a space where good can be done and enthusiastically jump in, assuming that they are the first to engage with it. This is almost never the reality, but because of their privilege, this brand new group may get all kinds of opportunities that were not available to the people already working on the issue. Intervention by an overrepresented group risks erasing those people who are often the ones most directly impacted by the issue. Um, And you have a pretty lengthy section in the book that talks about this aspect of, I guess the word that I would put on it is mindfulness. um, and I think it's interesting. I love how much your book lays out things that are not technical at all. And to me, this is one very important area. Respecting institutional DNA,
Mhm.
respecting the folks who are in spaces that you are new to. Um,
Mhm.
and I personally, I've even had, I've been checked. I've gone into spaces being like, I know exactly what we need. You know, take all of this away, do this, and people have been like, whoa, sit down and learn and listen
Mm.
and recognize that there's a whole context here, that it became my opportunity to really like to lean into and to own. And so I love how you started us off by talking about making new mistakes. How can new technologists in civic tech make new mistakes, that actually help the institutions, and not cause harm?
So I think one of the best ways is to give a lot of attention to people who have been in the space, whether they may be advocates who are working or are part of the community that's affected or are long-term career public servants. One of the things I think I say in the book is that they will tell you why what you want to do failed the last time and the time before that.
Mhm.
There's a whole lot of institutional memory. And one of the privileges I call out, in addition to kind of racial and gender privileges and the fact that tech isn't all that representative as an industry, so you're sort of automatically likely to be coming in to an industry government, which especially at the local levels tends to be a little more representative of the community from a majority perspective. And then you put the shine of, ooh, technology. Well, all those people are smart and hardworking and know lots of stuff automatically. And so you may get well more than your fair share of attention in a meeting. And if you aren't careful to attend to that and to make sure that you actively ask for input and actively listen and actively give credit
Mm.
to people who are not part of the technology innovation group, um, then you're going to miss things. And that can derail what you want to do, keep you from learning, harm people, and do a lot of other bad things. So it's sort of a first capability for a civic technologist is to be able to check yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think from my personal experience, it can also kind of damage the reputation of civic tech, right? Like I've heard personally, I've heard, if I'm being
Yeah.
transparent, I've heard like, oh God, you like civic tech people, you just come in here and like, it's like, oh
Right.
no, no, no,
You
no.
waltz in, you tell us to do something, our managers listen to you more than us. There's some
Yeah.
history with that. And it's important for everyone coming into the field to be aware.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I think that there are so many good examples of ways that is done well, and I love how you've laid them out in the book. Your book is so encouraging. It's just very encouraging
Oh,
to be
I'm
able to.
happy to hear that. I want to encourage people. It's funny, I talk a lot about how hard it is and so forth. And at the same time, I very much
Yeah,
want more people to join us.
yeah, no, I feel like the tone is very like, it's challenging and you can do this because everybody who has come before you has figured it out and you are a problem solver, and like, go for it. And I love that. And that's kind of the core theme that I took away. Anyway, next question that I have for you, is busting another myth, which is that faster is better. And this is kind of getting more into like the technical tech, right?
Yeah.
You said if you want to make a significant positive impact on people's lives as a civic technologist at some kind of scale, and you were starting from scratch, you should plan on a minimum of 2 years to see it through. 3 to
Yes.
5 years is more realistic in many situations. And even if you put in 5 years, there's no guarantee of success. But whether you succeed or fail in the short term, think of your work as part of the 50-year project and expect that your contribution will matter to some other person working on it. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about how, especially coming from private sector tech, you have rapid iteration, you're pushing updates all the time. That is not the case in civic tech. So what advice would you give to folks who are looking to make that transition, right? Like I think a part of it is mental, but a part of it is just like recognizing that what you're going into is going to be very different. There might be a little bit of culture shock that comes with that.
Culture shock, yeah.
Yeah.
Process
I'd love for you to talk about that a little bit. Not just in terms of mentally preparing, but in terms of like the tech, right? Like
shock.
I know me. I want to be. If I see a resource, if I know that there's a resource exists that will solve a thing, I'm like, put the resource on the thing. We're done. Moving on. How do we adjust to those technical differences also, that might allow us to really be compatible with this field?
Right. So there's a couple pieces of this, and I kind of want to caveat it by saying that prototyping is one of the really useful methods, and doing things significantly faster, but probably still not as fast as private sector, is also one of the kind of useful ways to show that something else is possible. And yet, a lot of the speed that we experience if we work in private sector tech has a lot of underpinnings, these sort of layers below the surface that you can't see, obviously. But let's say the team that you're working with and you want to quickly produce something doesn't have a CMS that handles modern web interfaces.
Yeah.
Let's say that they don't have a robust production environment with actual release processes. Let's say they don't have a staging environment. Let's say they don't have an easy way to procure SaaS software like, say, Slack or collaborative things like that. You're going to go through the time to establish a lot of those if you want your work to stick, and help people build that up. And so that's just, it's sort of free. If you're working at Google or you're working at Amazon or you're working at Airbnb, they have all of that. It's there. It may not be there in the same way in the public sector, and there's not the same ease of, hey, anything an engineer or designer wants on their machine, we can just get for them. Budgets work differently. IT departments tend to have a more protective stance, and that makes sense because often they're protecting public information or public funds, which are pretty important things to protect. At the same time, I find it a really interesting contrast that production environments are often not as formally or explicitly protected. I know I came up doing financial software in the 90s at Charles Schwab, and the trading environment was this sort of semi-holy thing that you did not mess with. And so, if you find a group that doesn't have a design system, doesn't have a modern CMS, doesn't have an easily usable database system, doesn't have GitHub accounts, doesn't have a production environment, doesn't have a set of release processes, doesn't have a product management infrastructure to think through the strategy of what you're doing, all that needs to be established in order to release something that might take a few months in a place where all of those things were pre-existing. It's really interesting work to establish them, but you can't just sort of throw something out there.
Yeah. And is it safe to assume that you will be a part of that establishing process as well?
Most of the time, I think, many civic technologists are surprised by how much time they spend coaching as opposed to hands-on keyboard doing design or coding or doing data stuff. So it takes a bent towards helping people, but also from a humble perspective. So it's not like, well, this is a much harder skill or a skill for smarter people than what you do. It's just hey, this is a useful thing I do, and I can show you how to do some of it.
Yeah, I love that. So when we talk about the civic part of civic tech, the public interest part, the service side, and just using government as kind of as our example institution, even though it is not the only government
Right.
institutions are not the only ones, right? But if we did use government institutions as our sample, you talk in the book about policy,
Yes.
um, and how you first educate us on how the impact and the impact and the change and the helping people and the good um, comes in the form of policies. Um,
Yes.
so that's first and foremost. Like we all need to know that, and then you kind of go into what that means, how a technologist might relate to policy, even in ways that they might not realize that they would, right? You said it's really important to understand the nuances of where a policy stands in order to see where technology can work with it. You also say power shifting may or may not be among your motivations for entering civic tech, but it will always be a potential consequence of your work. Can you speak to how, um, like you gave several examples in the book, but can you maybe share one with the group here that just kind of explains how an area of good or an area of need really does break down into policy, one, and how that policy might play an opportunity for a technologist to contribute?
Right. What I talk about in the book, and I'll be more brief here, is cannabis policy around the US. So there are, I think, a lot of technologists really excited to help jurisdictions expunge old marijuana convictions so that people don't have that on their records and can get better jobs, and access to housing and access to a lot of different services.
Yeah.
And I sort of track back through, the idea that as of around 1990, marijuana was absolutely illegal in every US state.
Mm.
And now we have that situation still in 5 or 6 states, but in many states, it's legal for medical purposes with sometimes, tighter or looser requirements on who can get access to that. And then in a few states, it's legal for all purposes for adults. Um, and on top of that sits the question of, okay, so something has become legal that wasn't legal before. That's a new statute. What do we do about the fact that there was discrimination in how the old statute was enforced and now it's out of play? So, do we want to consider either expunging convictions or potentially making sure that we provide access to the now legal market for people who were selling marijuana in the illegal market before, especially if they were harmed, by enforcement of that? Um, and basically, you need a policy to be in place for something like an automatic expungement technical solution to work. So Code for America has been working with the San Francisco district attorney and a couple of others around the country to do automatic expungement of records in batch so that people don't have to ask, they don't have to make a request, it's just gone because it's no longer at issue. And there's some cool technical work in there, but at the same time, it would go nowhere if it wasn't the policy of the local prosecutors to expunge these convictions.
Yeah, so really seeing how the policy and the technology work in tandem. They
Yes.
benefit each other, but the policy needs to be in place in order for the technologies.
Yeah, and technologists can help advocate for policy, but we're often not very educated in it. And that's another place where that's an entire field that people get PhDs in and so forth. And we certainly can critique the process just like our processes can be critiqued. But um, it's another thing we need to learn. One of the things I say is that policy implementation is where technology really has a strong role. So it's hard to actually change a policy just using technology. But if there is a policy that everyone should have access to unemployment assistance during a pandemic, let's just say for a random example, um, and the technology is poorly implemented, that can be the cause of the policy failing to have the effect that it needs and people not getting the assistance they need.
Yeah.
So that's a huge opportunity for a technology solution. But if the policy isn't there, then if you wanted to help people in a pandemic, you might take some other path.
Mm. That's great. I'm gonna ask another question, and before I do, I'm gonna remind the audience that if you have questions for Cyd, please add them to the Q&A function here, and we'd be happy to discuss them together. My next question for you, Cyd, is um, one thing that I was actually really excited to talk to you about in person, because I was like, I don't get this.
Ah,
Is you make a pretty strong case for an interested person first kind of identifying what their values are and what their own definition of good might be, and then finding the appropriate like agency or level of government that really is compatible with that, which could include, where policies are in place versus where policies are not in place. That was unexpected for me because I am not used to um, taking my problem solving skills specifically to places that already sort of align with what I'm
mm,
interested in doing. I'm more of a like throw any problem at me and I'll work on it kind of person. So I was wondering, and in the book you said where you begin will depend on your values as well as your capabilities. I'm used to just going off of the capabilities. So can you talk about, and your advice to interested tech folks, can you talk about how you're really encouraging people to orient around what matters to them, and how we might find that alignment, right? Like, how do I know what if the policies align? How do I know if this is the place for me in terms of what my values are and what my vision for good is?
right. So, I think this field encompasses a wide variety of party preference and political priorities. And so there are projects that go all kinds of different ways. For me, I want our field to really align with justice and care, but both of those words can be interpreted a lot of ways. So, you might think that something is in a state where the status quo is pretty good and it just needs to be more efficient or more effective. Um, or you might really think that things need to change. And there might be an opportunity for technology there. And in a couple of ways, it might be that there are people, who might be legislators or advocates or community groups advocating for change who need some sort of technology help to like put forward the data that supports their position in a really useful and readable way or something like that. Um, or it might be that there's an election going on and you might see that a new administration is maybe going to have a shift in priority. And so it just helps to kind of know. And the other thing I think is if you might be faced with working in a government where there might be a shift, what are your personal lines? So if a policy holder could come in who holds ideas or positions that are really hostile to things that you think are important, is there still good work that you can do in that person's administration? I believe that there often is, but most of us actually have some red lines. And I think it's really useful to know for yourself what those are. Um, so yeah, so what do you think you want to change in the government? And this is where saying, we're talking about institutions that have existed for hundreds of years. We're not going to change them lastingly in a year. That's why I think of a 50-year project. But we also need to be really honest that we are trying to shift, even if we're saying do it on the web, do it where people are, meet people on their phones. That's changing how a consequential institution relates to its members. And it's changing what membership means. And we should own the ways that our work could shift that and make sure that they're going in a way that aligns with our values.
Yeah, that's really powerful. I really appreciate that perspective, Sid, because um, it's It's so introspective, and it really reflects the significance of the work that's being done. Okay, we have a question from the chat.
Oh, cool.
Question is, Cyd, how might instructors or students use the book to impart some of these lessons and principles for learners who are early on their civic tech path? We have a lot of those at the Beeck Center.
It is definitely my hope that it could form, an optional book in a syllabus or a part of a syllabus. I think just the discussion we're having today
Yeah.
could present some interesting exercises for students to think through or write about, or inform, active hands-on projects. I know a lot of courses in this area are based around doing a demonstration project and thinking through students' principles and in project choice and project execution, I hope would be one thing that it would enable to be easier for professors and students. I hope it also gives an outline of what a future might look like, for people after they finish their training.
That's awesome. Yeah, we're doing a student project, and we will absolutely be using the guidance from your book to kind of explore the depths of the the mindsets of the students for actually creating a project that contributes to the field. And I think the framework here is perfect for that.
So cool.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. Next question is, do you have any advice for how to match my skills and interests to potential civic or public opportunities? Are there search sites, surveys, or questionnaires, job or volunteer position postings for this specific type of work?
Yes, there are, although this is some of what we need in our institutional architecture as we kind of go forward into our second 10 years or our teenage years. There is a Civic Hall has a site at civictech.guide that is a worldwide directory of civic technology projects. It's user generated, so it's not all at the same level of depth. Code for America runs a job board for US civic tech jobs. And in fact, for folks who are in a city where they have access to it, the Code for America Brigade Network is a great place to onboard sort of to the world in the field. Many cities have an organization that's called either Code for Milwaukee, I just talked to them recently, or Open Data City Name. And those typically have meetups monthly, or in some big cities, they're weekly, that welcome everyone and have some shovel-ready projects and so forth. And so that's a very useful resource for figuring out what might be going on where you are. And then there are starting to be a bigger network of companies hiring people. So to name a few off the top of my head, Ad Hoc, Nava, A1M, TrustWorks, all hire people from this sort of civic technology perspective into very recognizable tech jobs. And then there are digital service groups at the national, state, and city level. Not in every state yet and not in every city yet, but in quite a few.
Awesome. I'm just adding that to the chat for folks.
Oh, thank you.
Cool. We have another question. What is your vision for the public interest technology field as a whole?
I want to see it be considered an important part of how we co-create institutions, how institutions interface with their constituents and members seems like a really important way as we're sort of facing, decade or century long institutions that we now interact with on these devices and the software that maybe lasts months or a few years. And the idea of technology from a stewardship perspective rather than a profit perspective, I think is also a needed thread for the technology industry. So it's interesting. I have been working with the court system recently and have been helping my partners find resources on some things like running websites. And every resource from the last 8 or 10 years from the private sector basically talks about either an ad-driven engagement model or an e-commerce model, both of which are just catastrophically inappropriate for the court system. We don't have ads. We shouldn't be trying to engage people more. The court system really cannot have an opinion about whether you should file a particular case, although it can make it easier or harder for you to do it. And so just the development of an alternate thread in technology for how we practice, how we measure, how we build also seems like a really valuable thing for this public interest tech field. And I think, when you talk about it more broadly, it encompasses things like the Institute for Public Digital Infrastructure that Ethan Zuckerman is starting up at UMass Amherst, has institutions like the Beeck Center and some of the centers at the Kennedy School. And there is an architecture starting to come together. I want to see it have archives and conferences and a shelf of books. This is something I've been saying when I talk to people who, feel like they've been in it for a while, is please write a book. We need not just the few books that exist now, but a whole shelf of books from different perspectives and with different focuses to really develop this in. And this is one reason I appreciate the Beeck Center talking about this as field building. I think it's an important field, and I think that doing this work of turning it into a grounded, established field is really terrific.
That's great. Yeah. We are definitely seeing this as field building, and it's incredible. I love it. Okay, another question is, tech people tend to focus on tech skills, coding, DevOps, testing, automation tools, processes, etc., etc. Do you have any recommendations for technical people to learn about the ethical or philosophical aspects of public interest tech?
There are a lot. I have a huge further readings section. There are people who have grappled with this. Some of the key articles for me are probably Josh Tauber's great piece called So You Want to Reform Democracy, which is from, I think, 2015. There's an Atul Gawande article called Spreading Slow Ideas that I basically recommend to everyone in the field. There's an academic book called Seeing Like a State that I think is a really, really interesting grounding in some of what underlies state technology, and meaning state in the nation state sense, and kind of surveillance and metrics and accountability that I think is really interesting. The work of Creative Reaction Lab out of I'm going to always mess up St. Louis and Louisville, and that's terrible. I think it's St. Louis in their case. Wonderful design agency that really focuses on this and has some workshops around equity-centered community design. So there's not one reference, but there is a lot of work out there to get you started.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. I have another question for you, Cyd, which is specifically about you as an author. So the first question is, what was the most unexpected thing you learned in the process of writing this book?
Oh gosh, that is a good.
You just already knew all of the things.
No, I did. I did not know all of the things. I'm laughing because Cora Zarek is probably on the call, and she corrected some of my understanding of early federal civic tech history in a way that I hadn't expected. And despite the fact that I'd learned, I'd been in book publishing early in my career, so I knew a little bit about the process of writing a book is not just writing it, right? I learned a lot about what it takes to make a book really finished, and a whole new respect for editors. Even though I always liked them, it is so much a better book for the work that Sally Kerrigan and Karen Litherland, my editor and my copy editor, did to pull out snarky things that I said late at night when I was writing, and undensify paragraphs and really focus on some of those lists of questions that you and others have called out. And then, I asked a lot of people in civic technology to review chapters for me and just check my work, which was a very grateful and also humbling experience, just because, I got things wrong. I said things awkwardly. I uh, yeah. So there's been enormous time put into this, and it's funny, it's me talking on the webinar, but it's really an enormous team effort when you write a book.
Yeah, that's great. And you mentioned wanting to encourage other folks to write books and build the bookshelf.
Mm-hmm.
Is a great call to action too. That book can be from any perspective. And one of the things that we're hoping to do at the Beeck Center is to have more conversations like this with authors of books that should be on every public interest tech person or civic tech person's bookshelf. So thank you for for helping us kick that off, Cyd. And we're not done yet. I wanted to, if we have any more questions, keep them coming. I wanted to actually ask you if you could get into a little bit of uh, the tech requirements that you find in this space. Specific, you've alluded to it already, but we didn't actually talk about it, around security, privacy, accessibility, and how that can be, I guess, more stringent than expected, especially in a government space or a tax dollars funded space, and how that might impact what a technologist will experience in the field.
Right. I think the easiest way to put it maybe is that some things that you can, although maybe you shouldn't, call edge cases in the private sector are simply not edge cases when you're talking about a space where technology has to serve the whole public. So accessibility is non-negotiable. Language access is pretty non-negotiable. Plain language is really ought to be non-negotiable. That's an interesting one, and that there's a federal statute, and many states also have statutes, but they are one of the most disregarded statutes. One of the things we most need as a field is something that's sort of something like a prototyping suite that has a lot of accessibility features by default so that people don't have to build them over and over, and can prototype and test with all members of the community, regardless of ability. But it needs to impact, every piece of what we do. I think one of the things I talk about is recommending public libraries as spaces where you can do usability tests, partly because those are ADA compliant spaces that are clean and that generally everyone is welcome to. And so recasting your work towards being accessible, being fair by default, being equitable, is a difference in perspective from a profit space where it's like, well, we don't know if that's worth the investment at this point. We'll add it if this does well.
Yeah.
That's just not a defensible position for most public sector work. And I like that challenge. I appreciate that way of engaging.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Cyd. I want to start wrapping us up. And the last question that I have, I mean, you alluded to it a bit already, but are there any other resources or books that you might recommend for our public interest tech bookshelf, and for folks who are interested in learning more about the space?
There are a bunch, and I know there may be some histories coming out that I think are going to be really interesting. I know the design side best, but there's Andrew Schrock's book, Civic Tech, which is more of a storytelling and book of examples, and it's really short. There's Hannah Shank's The Government Fix, which is great. For the designers, if there are any on a call, there's Usability in Government Systems from way back around 2011, which is an edited volume of some of the early thinking. This is pre-gov.uk about what it means and how to do accessible, usable systems for government.
Awesome. thanks for those. I'll definitely be adding them to my personal hit bookshelf too. So I guess we will leave with just a closing thought. What do you want the aspiring civic tech folks who are on our call today to think or to feel or to do? What do you want them to walk away with?
I hope that they will feel optimistic and understand how useful their capabilities could be in combination with the knowledge and commitment of folks in public service. I hope they'll feel welcome in the field. And, what I often recommend people do is find a way to volunteer.
Yeah.
Doesn't have to be tech volunteering, but find a way to start learning something about the civic ecosystem where you are in your country or your city or your state. And I think as a problem solving technologist, if you do that, you'll start to see spaces where you might be able to help. It might not be the one, but just to start to think about, with the public interest held in mind, how could you use the skills that you've gained in your tech career to further us all having digital public goods that are as good as the ones we get from the private sector?
Yeah, awesome. Well, I will conclude with the closing paragraph of your book. If you don't mind, I'll read it.
I don't mind.
I hope that when I look back on this book in 2030, we'll have a vibrant, accessible field that has earned a place as a core discipline of good government and strong institutions. And I hope many of you will be honored contributors in ways I've barely begun to imagine. I love that so much.
I do hope that.
Oh, me too. I hope that too. That's so awesome. Well, thank you, Cyd. I would love to keep this conversation going, but we do need to stop a little bit early, just so that we can kind of wrap up. So to our esteemed guest, Cyd, thank you so much for joining me in conversation, for guiding curious technologists, and for your work in shaping the field of civic tech as a whole.